At the center of a polished Manhattan ballroom under crystal chandeliers and quiet judgment, Ethan Caldwell raised a glass and called his ex-wife to the stage. Elizabeth Warren walked forward without hesitation. "She taught me what failure looks like," he said, smiling as laughter scattered across the room. Beside him, Vanessa Blake stood radiant, her hand resting lightly on his arm, unbothered, almost amused. Phones lifted, eyes sharpened. Elizabeth did not defend herself. She didn't need to. Because no one in that room knew. The company Vanessa was about to inherit already belonged to Elizabeth. If you believe dignity doesn't need to shout to be powerful, stay with this story until the end. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every comment. And if stories about quiet strength and real justice speak to you, consider subscribing. Long before the chandeliers, before the laughter that cut sharper than any accusation, before the quiet storm, Elizabeth Warren would one day bring into a room that believed itself untouchable. There had been a marriage that looked from the outside entirely unremarkable. It began the way many respectable American marriages do, with mutual ambition, polite admiration, and the quiet understanding that success, if pursued together, might soften the harder edges of life. Elizabeth Warren was not the kind of woman who filled a room with her voice. She filled it with structure. A corporate attorney by profession, she built her reputation not on spectacle, but on precision. Contracts, compliance frameworks, regulatory shields. She understood how systems held together, and more importantly, how they failed. Her colleagues respected her not because she sought attention, but because she rarely needed to speak twice. Ethan Caldwell, on the other hand, thrived in rooms that required presence. He was articulate, persuasive, and instinctively aware of how people perceived him. Where Elizabeth built quietly, Ethan presented boldly. He understood narratives, how to frame them, how to sell them, and how to position himself at the center of them. In the early years, this difference felt complementary. Elizabeth handled the invisible architecture, reviewing contracts, identifying risks, advising on partnerships that Ethan brought home with excitement still in his voice. Ethan, in turn, provided movement opportunities, introductions, expansion. They were, to those observing from a distance, an efficient system. But efficiency, when mistaken for intimacy, has its limits. In the first year of their marriage, Ethan often asked for Elizabeth's opinion, not casually but deliberately. He valued her clarity. He depended on it. When negotiations stalled, he would bring her drafts late into the evening, watching as she marked them with careful edits that often shifted entire outcomes. "You see things other people don't," he once told her, leaning back in his chair, equal parts impressed and relieved. Elizabeth had only nodded. She did not need praise. She needed accuracy. As Ethan's professional life began to accelerate, so did the subtle shifts in how he positioned that success. At first, it was small. A presentation where he omitted mentioning her input, a meeting where he rephrased her analysis as if it had been his instinct. These were not acts of betrayal in the traditional sense. They were adjustments, small recalibrations in narrative ownership. Elizabeth noticed. She always noticed. But noticing was not the same as reacting. Instead, she began to observe with greater intention. Ethan's schedule became less predictable. Meetings extended later into the evening. Dinners were rescheduled, then forgotten, then replaced with brief explanations that carried just enough plausibility to avoid confrontation. "I told you about this," he would say occasionally, not defensively, but with a certainty that suggested memory could be negotiated. Elizabeth never argued over memory. She simply began to keep her own records. Not formally, not yet. Just mentally. Patterns. Frequencies. Gaps. There were also financial changes, subtle but distinct enough to stand apart from normal variation. Ethan had always been transparent with money, at least in principle. Joint accounts, shared planning, clear discussions about investments. That transparency began to narrow. Transactions became more frequent, smaller in size but less explained. Again, not alarming on their own. But Elizabeth did not evaluate events in isolation. She evaluated systems. And the system was shifting. There was a particular evening quiet in its surface details that marked the first moment Elizabeth understood that something deeper was unfolding. Ethan returned home later than usual, carrying the faint trace of a conversation that had not ended where he said it had. His tone was controlled, almost rehearsed. He spoke about a potential collaboration, a startup in the financial technology space. "Something with real upside," he said, his eyes briefly lighting up in a way Elizabeth had not seen directed at her in some time. Monarch Axis Group, he added, almost as an afterthought. Elizabeth nodded once. Who's leading it, she asked. Ethan hesitated, not long enough to be obvious, but long enough to register. A strong team, he replied. Operations are tight. Smart people. He did not answer the question directly. Elizabeth did not repeat it. Instead, she made a note. Not on paper. Not yet. Just a quiet adjustment in her internal map. From that point forward, she paid closer attention not to what Ethan said, but to what he omitted. His phone, once left casually on counters and tables, was now rarely out of reach. Notifications appeared, then disappeared before they could be read. Conversations paused when she entered the room, then resumed later with altered tone. None of this was dramatic. There were no confrontations, no raised voices, no visible fractures that would invite sympathy or intervention. To anyone watching from the outside, their marriage remained intact, functional, respectable. But Elizabeth was not watching from the outside. She was inside the system as it recalibrated, and she understood something Ethan did not yet realize. Silence is not the absence of awareness. It is often the presence of it refined. She did not ask him if there was someone else. She did not search his phone. She did not accuse. Instead, she shifted her own position. Where she had once been responsive, she became observant. Where she had once participated, she began to document, subtly, indirectly, but with increasing clarity. Because Elizabeth Warren did not respond to uncertainty with emotion. She responded with structure, and structure, when built correctly, does not rush, it waits. Even then, she did not yet know the name Vanessa Blake would come to carry in her life. She did not yet see the full shape of what Ethan was building outside the boundaries of their marriage. But she understood the direction. And more importantly, she understood that whatever came next would not be resolved through conversation. It would unfold through evidence, quietly, precisely, and without warning. Elizabeth Warren did not discover the truth all at once. It arrived the way most consequential things do, quietly, without ceremony, layered in fragments that only made sense when viewed together. By the time the pattern became undeniable, she had already been watching long enough to understand that what she was seeing was not a deviation. It was a structure. The name came first, though not in the way Ethan might have expected. Vanessa Blake did not appear in a message or a call log or anything so obvious. She appeared in a document, an internal report Ethan had left open on his laptop one evening, likely assuming Elizabeth would have no interest in it. He underestimated the way she read. The report belonged to Monarch Axis Group. It outlined operational projections, departmental efficiency metrics, and a leadership note signed simply, V. Blake, Chief Operating Officer. Elizabeth did not react when she saw it. She read the entire document instead. Line by line. Margins, footnotes, inconsistencies. Vanessa Blake, she noted, was not just involved. She was central. That mattered, because Ethan had described Monarch Axis as an opportunity, something external, something he might eventually connect with. But this document suggested something closer, something already in motion. Elizabeth closed the laptop exactly as she had found it. She did not ask Ethan about Vanessa. She did not mention Monarch Axis again. Instead, she began to observe with greater precision. The next confirmation came through scheduling, less direct but more revealing. Ethan had grown careless with overlap. 2 dinners in the same week, both described vaguely as client meetings, both placed in locations that did not align with his usual business patterns. Elizabeth did not question him. She verified, using access she already had, shared calendars, archived emails, logistical details she had once helped organize. She began reconstructing his movements. The overlap was not accidental. It was intentional. And more importantly, it was consistent. Then came the financial layer. Elizabeth had always managed their joint accounts with quiet diligence. Not control, never control, but clarity. She knew where money moved, how it flowed, what justified its direction. That clarity had begun to fracture months ago. Now, with purpose guiding her attention, she examined the details more closely. There were charges that did not align with Ethan's explanations. Boutique hotels, expensive, but not extravagant enough to draw suspicion at first glance. Restaurants that catered more to intimacy than business. Repeated expenditures in patterns that suggested routine, not coincidence. Still, none of this was definitive on its own. Elizabeth did not build conclusions from single points of data. She built them from convergence. So she waited, and she collected. Emails were next. Not hacked, not stolen, simply accessed through channels Ethan had once trusted her with. Archived threads, overlooked exchanges, fragments of communication that revealed more in tone than in content. Vanessa Blake's name began to appear again. At first, formally, professional language, structured communication, clean boundaries, then gradually less so. Timing shifted. Messages extended beyond standard hours. The language softened subtly but unmistakably. Elizabeth did not need explicit confirmation. She understood escalation when she saw it. There was a moment, small, almost forgettable in its appearance, when everything aligned. It happened on a Tuesday evening. Ethan had told her he would be late. A board discussion, he said. Complex, unavoidable. Elizabeth nodded as she always did. But that night she reviewed the calendar entries more carefully. There was no board meeting scheduled. Instead, there was a placeholder, something generic inserted where a more specific entry might have been. Elizabeth cross-referenced. Location data, previous patterns, financial behavior. Then, for the first time, she stepped slightly outside her usual restraint. Not dramatically, just enough. She drove to the location the data suggested, not to confront, not to interrupt, only to confirm. The restaurant was discreet, designed for privacy. Soft lighting, quiet corners, the kind of place where conversations were meant to remain contained. Elizabeth did not enter. She did not need to. From across the street, through glass that reflected just enough to obscure without hiding, she saw them. Ethan and Vanessa, seated close, not across from each other as business partners might sit. Beside, the distance between them, minimal, intentional. Their conversation was relaxed, unguarded. Ethan leaned in slightly, his posture different from the one he brought home. Less calculated. More invested. Vanessa smiled, in a way that suggested familiarity, not newness, not uncertainty. This was not the beginning of something. It was already established. Elizabeth watched for less than a minute. Then she turned and left. There was no hesitation in her movement. No visible reaction, because what she had needed was not emotional confirmation. It was structural clarity. And now she had it. From that point forward, Elizabeth's approach changed not in intensity but in method. She no longer observed passively. She documented, carefully, systematically. Emails were archived with timestamps. Financial records were organized by pattern, not just date. Schedules were reconstructed into timelines that revealed overlap, frequency, and intent. She did not rush the process. She did not skip steps. Because Elizabeth understood something fundamental. Truth, when presented without structure, can be dismissed. But truth, when supported by systems, becomes undeniable. Still, she did not confront Ethan. Not once. He continued as he had been moving between two realities, believing himself capable of maintaining both. At home, he remained functional, polite, occasionally attentive in ways that felt more habitual than genuine. Outside with Vanessa, he was something else. Elizabeth did not need to define it. She only needed to understand its implications. There was also the matter of money. The deeper she looked, the clearer it became that Ethan was not simply spending. He was reallocating. Funds from joint accounts had begun to move through less transparent channels. Not illegally, at least not obviously, but strategically obscured. Small amounts at first, then larger. Investments, he might have called them. But the destinations did not align with his stated intentions. Some of those funds, Elizabeth noted, connected indirectly to Monarch Axis Group. Not publicly. Not in ways that would raise immediate concern, but enough to suggest involvement beyond casual interest. Ethan was not just involved with Vanessa. He was entangled in her world, and he was using shared resources to support that entanglement. Elizabeth did not interrupt. She did not warn him, because interruption would only alter behavior, and altered behavior produces incomplete data. Instead, she allowed the system to continue, allowed Ethan to believe he was in control, allowed Vanessa to operate within a structure she did not yet fully understand. Elizabeth's role in all of this remained unchanged on the surface. She went to work. She returned home. She spoke when necessary. She listened more than she spoke. But beneath that stillness, something precise was forming. Not anger, not revenge. Alignment. Every piece of information she gathered was not just evidence of betrayal. It was part of a larger configuration, one that extended beyond marriage, beyond emotion, into territory where outcomes were not decided by confrontation, but by positioning. Ethan believed he was building a future. Vanessa believed she was ascending into power. Neither of them yet understood that the structure they were standing on was already being mapped by someone who did not need to raise her voice to change its direction. Ethan Caldwell did not confess. He did not hesitate either. By the time he asked for the divorce, he had already rewritten the story in his mind, one in which timing justified action and action once taken no longer required explanation. It happened on a Thursday evening. There was nothing remarkable about the setting. No raised voices, no shattered objects, no visible signs of collapse that might have given the moment the weight it deserved. Elizabeth Warren was seated at the dining table, reviewing a contract with the same quiet focus she brought to everything she touched. The light above her cast a soft, steady glow, controlled, predictable. Ethan stood across from her, not sitting, not fully settled. His posture suggested preparation, not conversation. "We should talk," he said. Elizabeth did not look up immediately. She finished the line she was reading, placed a small mark beside a clause, then closed the folder. Only then did she meet his eyes. "All right," she replied. There was no tension in her voice. Ethan seemed to expect more, some indication that the moment carried emotional weight. When it didn't come, he shifted slightly, recalibrating. "This isn't working," he said. The sentence was practiced. Not rehearsed, word for word perhaps, but shaped in advance. It carried the tone of someone who had already decided what the outcome would be. Elizabeth listened. She did not interrupt. "I think we both know that," he continued. "We've grown in different directions. It's time to be honest about that." Honesty. The word hovered briefly between them, unchallenged. Elizabeth tilted her head just slightly, not in disagreement, but in acknowledgement of structure. "And what does that honesty look like to you?" she asked. Ethan exhaled as if relieved to move forward. "A clean break," he said. "No drawn-out process. We divide things fairly quickly. No need to complicate it. Fairly. Quickly. No complications." The language was efficient, strategic. Elizabeth recognized it immediately. He was not asking. He was proposing a framework designed to limit scrutiny. She nodded once. "That would depend on how fair is defined," she said. Ethan gave a small, controlled smile. "We've always been reasonable," he replied. "There's no reason that should change now." Elizabeth held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Then she reached for a pen. "Then let's define it properly," she said. There was no resistance in her tone, no visible attachment to what was ending. And that, more than anything, unsettled Ethan. He had anticipated difficulty, emotion, perhaps even conflict he could manage, navigate, and ultimately position himself above. Instead, he found none of it. Elizabeth did not ask if there was someone else. She did not reference the inconsistencies she had already mapped. She did not present evidence. Because she understood something Ethan did not. Timing determines leverage, and this was not the moment. The divorce process began the following week. Ethan moved quickly, too quickly. He presented documents, drafted with a level of readiness that suggested preparation had begun long before the conversation at the dining table. Asset summaries, account distributions, proposed settlements structured in a way that appeared balanced on the surface but lacked depth. Elizabeth reviewed everything without comment, line by line, clause by clause. She did not challenge immediately. She catalogued. There were discrepancies, not obvious ones, but enough. Accounts that had been minimized in valuation. Investments that were referenced vaguely, without full disclosure. Transfers that appeared legitimate, but lacked supporting detail. Elizabeth did not react. She requested documentation, formally, through proper channels. Ethan complied partially, just enough to maintain the appearance of transparency. Not enough to reveal the full structure. It was a calculated move, but incomplete, because Ethan underestimated two things. The first was Elizabeth's patience. The second was her understanding of systems designed to obscure. She began to reconstruct the financial landscape independently, not by challenging what was presented but by identifying what was missing. Shell entities began to surface, corporate structures that existed just outside the primary financial disclosures, entities with minimal operational footprint yet consistent transactional activity. Elizabeth traced them, carefully, not rushing conclusions, allowing patterns to emerge. Some of these entities connected indirectly to Monarch Axis Group, not in ways that would immediately raise legal alarms, but in ways that suggested intentional distance. Funds moved from joint accounts into secondary structures, then redirected. Ethan had not hidden the movement. He had diluted it, distributed it across layers that individually appeared insignificant, but together formed a system. Elizabeth understood the system. She did not expose it. Not yet. Instead, she adjusted her approach. Where Ethan pushed for speed, Elizabeth introduced precision, requests for clarification, additional documentation, revisions to language that required more explicit disclosure. Each step small, reasonable, difficult to refuse without appearing evasive. Ethan began to show signs of irritation. "This doesn't need to be this complicated," he said during one of their meetings. Elizabeth looked at him calmly. "It isn't complicated," she replied. "It's defined." The distinction mattered. Complication suggests unnecessary difficulty. Definition ensures clarity. Ethan did not argue the point, but his patience thinned. The more Elizabeth asked, the more he realized the process was not unfolding as quickly as he had planned. Still, she did not accuse him. She did not mention Vanessa. She did not reveal that she understood the movement of funds, because accusation would shift the dynamic. It would give Ethan something to respond to, something to defend. Elizabeth was not interested in defense. She was building position. Eventually, the settlement reached a point where further delay would draw attention. Ethan pushed. Elizabeth allowed it to proceed. On the surface, the divorce concluded efficiently. Assets were divided, accounts separated, legal documentation finalized. To anyone observing externally, it appeared clean, professional, uncomplicated. Ethan seemed satisfied. He had exited the marriage without public conflict, without exposure, with what he believed to be control over his financial trajectory. Vanessa, though never mentioned directly in the proceedings, remained an unspoken, constant present in Ethan's decisions, influencing his urgency, shaping his need for closure. Elizabeth signed the final documents without hesitation, her expression unchanged, her posture steady. She did not look at Ethan when it was done. She did not ask questions. She did not seek acknowledgement, because she already had what she needed, not from the settlement itself, but from what the process had revealed. Ethan believed the divorce had freed him, that he had closed one chapter cleanly, efficiently, and without consequence. He believed the system had worked in his favor, and in some ways it had, but systems, when misunderstood, often appear stable just before they shift. Elizabeth did not leave the process empty-handed. She left it informed, with a complete map of financial pathways, with documented patterns of behavior, with clarity not just about what Ethan had done but how he had done it, and most importantly, where those actions led. She did not confront him as she walked away. She did not warn him, because warning alters outcomes, and Elizabeth was no longer interested in altering what Ethan would do next. She was interested in allowing it to unfold, naturally, predictably. Within a structure she now understood better than he did. The divorce was not the end of anything. It was a transition, a repositioning. And as Elizabeth stepped out of the legal framework of the marriage, she did so without visible loss, only quiet alignment. Because while Ethan believed he had simplified his life, Elizabeth had identified its vulnerabilities. And she had done so without ever raising her voice. The divorce finalized without spectacle. No raised voices echoed through hallways. No whispered scandals leaked into professional circles. No one outside the necessary legal participants had reason to question the outcome. From a distance, it appeared efficient, controlled, even civilized. Ethan Caldwell moved forward, as though he had simply stepped out of one phase of his life and into another, lighter, unencumbered, and increasingly aligned with the version of success he preferred to present. Elizabeth Warren did the same. At least, that was how it looked. But while Ethan moved forward, Elizabeth shifted position. The difference was not visible. It rarely is when done correctly. She did not begin with action. She began with verification. Monarch Axis Group had been a name, an entity Ethan mentioned with careful vagueness. A company that existed at the edge of his narrative, but never fully within it. Now Elizabeth approached it not as a reference, but as a structure to be understood. Public filings came first. They were clean, deliberately so. Incorporation, documents, leadership listings, capital disclosures, everything aligned with standard expectations for a mid-tier financial technology firm, positioning itself for growth. Vanessa Blake appeared exactly where she should: Chief Operating Officer, transitioning toward executive leadership. Nothing in those documents suggested instability. Nothing revealed the internal dynamics Elizabeth suspected. That was expected. Public structures are designed to conceal complexity. Elizabeth was interested in what existed beneath them. She accessed what she could through legal channels, databases, investment disclosures, secondary reports. Where access was limited, she observed patterns instead of forcing entry. Capital flow, partnership announcements, timing of expansions. Monarch Axis was growing, but not evenly. There were surges of capital followed by periods of quiet consolidation. Investment rounds that appeared well supported externally yet lacked the kind of institutional backing that would normally accompany such acceleration. Elizabeth did not interpret this as weakness. She interpreted it as opportunity, because uneven growth, when properly understood, creates leverage points. She did not approach Monarch Axis directly. She approached the structure around it. Redwood Capital Partners was not a large firm. It was not meant to be. Mid-sized, discreet, operating with enough credibility to access opportunities, but not enough visibility to attract unnecessary attention. Its portfolio suggested selectivity rather than scale. That made it useful. Elizabeth initiated contact through intermediaries, not with urgency, not with intention that could be easily traced, just enough to establish presence. Initial conversations were exploratory. Redwood had already shown peripheral interest in financial technology sectors. Monarch Axis had appeared briefly in internal discussions, but had not yet been pursued aggressively. Elizabeth did not recommend immediate action. She asked questions. What would it take for Redwood to consider a deeper position? What thresholds mattered? What conditions would need to align? The answers were predictable. Valuation, timing, access. Elizabeth listened. Then she adjusted the variables. Her involvement remained invisible. She did not present herself as the driver of the decision. Instead, she became the mechanism through which the decision became possible. Information flowed carefully, filtered, strategically timed. Market signals that suggested Monarch Axis was approaching a critical expansion phase. Indicators that early positioning could yield disproportionate influence. None of it false. All of it incomplete. Just enough to shift interest into action. Redwood moved, not aggressively, but deliberately. An initial minority stake. Small enough to avoid scrutiny. Large enough to establish entry. Elizabeth watched. She did not intervene in the first phase. She allowed the system to respond. Monarch Axis accepted the investment. Naturally, the company needed capital, and Redwood offered it without complication. Vanessa Blake approved the decision. From her perspective, it was straightforward. Another investor, another layer of validation, another step upward. Ethan supported it. He saw Redwood as neutral, unthreatening. Just another piece in the expansion he believed he was helping shape. Neither of them questioned the source. They did not need to, because the structure was designed not to be questioned. Elizabeth waited. Then she moved again. Additional investments followed, not all through Redwood directly. Secondary entities, affiliated channels, layered participation that over time increased influence without concentrating visibility. Ownership did not need to be declared loudly to be effective. It only needed to be accurate. Each round of investment was positioned carefully. Never too large, never too obvious, but always consistent. Over time, Redwood's stake grew, quietly, predictably, until it reached a point where absence would have been more noticeable than presence. Still, Elizabeth's name did not appear. Not in filings, not in disclosures, not in conversations. She remained where she had always been most effective, behind the structure, monitoring, adjusting, allowing others to believe they were in control. Vanessa's role within Monarch Axis expanded during this period. She transitioned fully into the CEO position, her leadership framed as a natural progression earned justified inevitable. She spoke confidently in interviews, presented growth strategies, outlined visions of expansion that aligned with the company's upward trajectory. From the outside, she appeared exactly what the market valued: capable, decisive, forward-moving. Ethan positioned himself beside her, not formally embedded in the company but present enough to influence direction. He referred to his role as advisory, strategic, flexible. In reality, his involvement was less defined. He contributed ideas, made introductions, participated in conversations that shaped perception more than structure. Elizabeth observed all of it, not critically, not emotionally, just analytically, because she understood something neither Ethan nor Vanessa had fully accounted for. Influence is not determined by visibility. It is determined by position. And position, once established correctly, does not need to assert itself. It only needs to exist. By the time Redwood's stake approached, controlling interest through layered holdings, aggregated influence, and strategic alignment, Elizabeth had already completed the transition. She was no longer an observer of Monarch Axis. She was part of its foundation. Not publicly, not visibly, but structurally. And structure, when built correctly, defines outcomes long before they appear. Ethan still believed he was moving forward, building something new, something independent from the past he had left behind. Vanessa believed she was leading, making decisions, shaping the company's future through her own authority. Neither of them realized that the system they were operating within had already been recalibrated, quietly, precisely, and without interruption. Elizabeth did not need to announce her presence, because when the time came, it would already be undeniable. In the months that followed, Elizabeth Warren's quiet repositioning the lives of Ethan Caldwell and Vanessa Blake unfolded with a kind of visible momentum that often convinces outsiders of inevitability. Their relationship, once discreet and carefully managed within overlapping schedules and concealed transactions, transitioned into something far more public, polished, deliberate, and increasingly difficult to separate from the narrative of success they were constructing around Monarch Axis Group. It began with appearances. At first, they were subtle. A photograph taken at a networking event, a mention in a business publication that described Vanessa as a rising executive voice, accompanied by a passing reference to Ethan as a strategic advisor within her professional circle. There was nothing overtly personal in these early signals, yet the consistency of their proximity suggested more than coincidence to anyone paying attention. Elizabeth noticed, of course, but she did not dwell on the personal implications of what she saw. Instead, she examined the pattern of exposure, the timing, the platforms, the gradual normalization of their association. Public perception, she understood, was not built in a single moment. It was layered through repetition until it appeared self-evident. Soon, the images became less ambiguous. Vanessa and Ethan began appearing together in contexts that blurred the line between professional collaboration and personal partnership. Industry panels, charity galas, investor mixers, each setting offered a slightly different angle of the same narrative. A dynamic, forward-looking duo aligned not only in business ambition, but in shared vision. Their social media presence evolved accordingly. Vanessa's profiles, once strictly professional, began incorporating curated glimpses of her life outside the office, carefully framed moments that hinted at balance, success, and connection. Ethan appeared in these moments with increasing frequency, always positioned as complementary rather than central, yet undeniably present. Ethan, for his part, leaned into the visibility. He amplified their shared appearances through his own channels, reshaping his identity from independent operator to integrated strategist within Vanessa's orbit. His language shifted subtly over time. Where he once spoke of individual ventures and personal achievements, he now emphasized collaboration, alignment, and collective growth. To observers, the transformation seemed natural. To Elizabeth, it was structured. Because while the external narrative gained clarity, the internal operations of Monarch Axis Group began to reveal inconsistencies that did not align with the image being projected. Vanessa's transition into the role of Chief Executive Officer was announced with confidence. The board presented it as a strategic evolution, an acknowledgement of her operational leadership and her capacity to guide the company through its next phase of expansion. There was no visible resistance, no indication of internal dissent. From the outside, the transition appeared seamless. Elizabeth reviewed the announcement twice, not for its content, but for its omissions. The language emphasized growth, innovation, and continuity, yet it avoided specificity regarding governance adjustments, oversight mechanisms, and financial restructuring elements that typically accompany leadership transitions of that scale. This absence did not indicate failure. It indicated compression. Decisions were being made faster than they were being documented. And in corporate structures, acceleration without documentation often creates vulnerabilities. Vanessa embraced her new position with a level of confidence that bordered on certainty. Her public statements reflected ambition framed as inevitability. She spoke of scaling operations, expanding into new markets, and redefining the company's role within the financial technology sector. Her interviews were precise but not cautious. She projected control. Ethan's presence within the company evolved alongside her ascent. Although he did not hold an official executive title, his involvement deepened in ways that extended beyond informal advisory. He participated in strategic meetings, contributed to discussions regarding capital allocation, and positioned himself as an intermediary between Vanessa and potential partners. His influence was not codified. It did not need to be. In environments where authority is assumed rather than assigned, perception often substitutes for structure. Elizabeth observed the distinction. Because perception, while powerful, does not withstand scrutiny in the same way structure does. The financial patterns within Monarch Axis began to shift in tandem with these developments. Investment rounds increased in frequency, yet their composition raised questions. Instead of relying on established institutional investors, the company drew capital from a mixture of mid-tier funds, private channels, and less conventional sources. This diversification was not inherently problematic. However, the sequencing of these investments suggested a reactive approach rather than a strategic one. Funds were being secured to support decisions that had already been made, rather than decisions being shaped by available capital. Elizabeth traced the flow carefully, noting how funds entered the system, how they were allocated, and how they exited. Certain expenditures stood out not because they were excessive, but because they lacked alignment with the company's stated priorities. Marketing initiatives that exceeded projected returns, operational expansions that outpaced logistical support, and more subtly transfers that intersected with entities Elizabeth had previously identified during the divorce process. Ethan's influence, though unofficial, was now embedded within these patterns. He was not merely adjacent to the company, he was affecting its direction. Vanessa, whether aware of the full extent of this influence or not, allowed it to continue, perhaps because it appeared beneficial, perhaps because it aligned with her immediate objectives, or perhaps because the distinction between personal trust and professional oversight had already blurred beyond recognition. Elizabeth did not speculate on Vanessa's motivations. She did not need to. Motivation in her analysis was secondary to outcome. What mattered was the system that was forming, and that system was becoming increasingly dependent on assumptions that had not been tested. Publicly, the narrative remained intact. Monarch Axis Group was growing. Vanessa Blake was celebrated as a decisive leader. Ethan Caldwell was perceived as a strategic mind operating just outside formal constraints. Their relationship was framed as a partnership that strengthened both personal and professional trajectories. It was a compelling story, one that attracted attention, validation, and continued investment. But beneath that narrative, the structure continued to evolve in ways that neither Ethan nor Vanessa fully controlled. Redwood Capital Partners maintained its position quietly, expanding influence through additional allocations that appeared incremental but when aggregated altered the balance of ownership. Elizabeth did not accelerate this process. She allowed it to progress at a pace that aligned with the company's own expansion. Because sudden shifts invite scrutiny, gradual ones become accepted. By the time Redwood's influence approached a threshold where decisions could be shaped, rather than merely observed, the transition felt organic, unremarkable, inevitable. Ethan remained unaware of the full extent of this shift. He saw Redwood as a participant, not as a controlling force. Vanessa acknowledged Redwood as an important investor, but not as one that defined the company's direction. Both of them operated within a perception of autonomy, a belief that they were steering the system rather than responding to it. Elizabeth understood the inversion. She did not correct it, because control once revealed prematurely invites resistance. Control, when revealed at the appropriate moment, defines outcomes, and that moment had not yet arrived. Instead, she continued to observe, to document, to align, allowing Ethan and Vanessa to build their narrative to its fullest extent, allowing the system to expand until its internal contradictions became unavoidable. Because only then, when perception and structure diverged beyond reconciliation, would the truth require no explanation. The invitation arrived on a Monday morning, folded into a cream envelope that carried a weight disproportionate to its size. It was delivered not through casual channels, not by message or email, but by hand, placed among Elizabeth Warren's incoming correspondence with the same quiet certainty that had defined every other calculated gesture in Ethan Caldwell's recent life. Elizabeth noticed it immediately, not because it stood out dramatically, but because it did not attempt to. The envelope bore her name in precise, embossed lettering. No flourish, no unnecessary ornament. Just enough formality to suggest respect, and just enough intention to imply something else beneath it. She set aside the document she had been reviewing and opened it without hesitation. Inside, the card was elegantly structured. White stock, gold serif type, clean spacing, the kind of design that conveyed taste without excess. Ethan Caldwell and Vanessa Blake request the honor of your presence. Elizabeth read the full text once, then again. The date, the venue, the timing, everything aligned with what she had already observed in the trajectory of their public lives. The progression from discreet association to visible partnership had led predictably to this point. What mattered was not the event itself. It was the intention behind the invitation. Ethan did not need Elizabeth's presence to validate his marriage. Vanessa did not need Elizabeth's approval to legitimize her position. So the question was not, why invite her? The question was, why invite her visibly? Elizabeth placed the card back into its envelope and set it on her desk. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she allowed the moment to settle, not emotionally but structurally. Because invitations, like contracts, are rarely neutral. They create context. They define expectations. And in this case, the expectation was not subtle. 2 hours later, her phone vibrated. A message. From Ethan. I assume you received it. Elizabeth read the text without expression. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of the past, just confirmation, direct, controlled. She waited a moment before responding. I did. The reply came quickly. It would be appropriate for you to attend. Appropriate. The word carried more implication than explanation. Elizabeth understood it immediately. This was not a request framed by courtesy. It was a positioning. A public inclusion designed to serve a purpose that extended beyond etiquette. She typed her response with the same precision she applied to everything else. I'll confirm through the RSVP. She did not engage further. Ethan did not reply. The exchange ended exactly where it needed to. Later that afternoon, Elizabeth stepped out for a brief meeting with a colleague, Daniel Reeves, a senior partner at the firm she had collaborated with during the latter stages of her divorce. Daniel had seen enough of the process to understand its surface, not its depth. They met in a quiet conference room, the kind that muted sound and contained conversation within its walls. You're not seriously considering going, are you? Daniel asked after Elizabeth mentioned the invitation. His tone was measured but not neutral. Elizabeth placed the envelope on the table between them. I haven't declined, she said. Daniel leaned back slightly, studying her. That's not the same as saying yes, he replied. No, Elizabeth agreed. It isn't. There was a brief silence. Daniel tapped a finger lightly against the table as if organizing his thoughts. From a legal standpoint, he continued, there's no benefit to you being there. No exposure, no leverage. If anything, it creates risk, unnecessary visibility, potential provocation. Elizabeth listened. She did not interrupt. And from a personal standpoint, Daniel added, I don't see what you gain. Elizabeth folded her hands calmly. This isn't about gain, she said. Daniel watched her for a moment longer. Then he exhaled quietly. That's what concerns me, he replied. Elizabeth did not explain further, because explanation would require reducing the situation to something simpler than it was. And it was not simple. The decision to attend was not impulsive. It was not emotional. It was aligned. Later that evening, Elizabeth returned home and began to prepare not for the event itself, but for what would surround it. She opened her laptop and accessed a secured folder. Within it were months of collected data, emails, financial records, transaction logs, internal reports, organized not chronologically but relationally, each piece connected to another, each pattern mapped. She reviewed them again, not because she needed to confirm their validity, but because timing required precision. An event like the one Ethan had planned would bring together a specific audience: investors, legal professionals, advisors, individuals whose presence would transform information into consequence. Elizabeth understood that context. She did not intend to create a scene. She did not intend to confront. But she did intend to ensure that if the system reached a point where exposure became inevitable, it would occur within a framework that could not be dismissed. She began with the email, drafted carefully, addressed to the appropriate recipients within Monarch Axis Group: board members, legal oversight, compliance officers. The language was formal, objective, supported by evidence that required no interpretation. She did not accuse. She presented. Each claim anchored to documentation. Each conclusion derived from verifiable data. When she finished, she did not send it. Instead, she scheduled it, timed precisely, not for the moment of the ceremony, not for its beginning, but for a point when attention would be highest, when visibility would amplify impact. Then she moved to the financial records, selected extracts, not the entire data set, only what was necessary. Clarity, she understood, depended not on volume but on relevance. Too much information invites confusion. The right amount creates certainty. She compiled the documents into a format that could be accessed quickly if needed. Secure, traceable, defensible. Finally, she prepared herself. Not outwardly. There was no elaborate planning of appearance, no attempt to anticipate reactions. Her preparation was internal. Alignment. Understanding exactly what she would and would not do. She would attend. She would observe. She would not react to provocation. She would not interrupt. She would allow the system to unfold, and if the moment required it, she would not hesitate. The RSVP was sent the next morning. A single confirmation. No note. No addition. Just acceptance. Ethan received it shortly after. He read the response once. Then again. A faint smile crossed his face, not of relief but of satisfaction. He interpreted her decision as agreement, as compliance, as participation within a narrative he believed he controlled. Vanessa, when informed, reacted differently. She did not object, but she asked a question. "Are you sure that's necessary?" Ethan dismissed the concern with a casual certainty. "It closes the chapter," he said, publicly. Vanessa considered that, then nodded. Neither of them questioned the deeper implications, because from their perspective the system was stable. The narrative was clear. The outcome was already defined. Elizabeth Warren would attend. She would witness, and she would remain what they believed her to be, a figure from the past, present, only to validate the future they had constructed. Elizabeth, meanwhile, returned to her work, her routine unchanged, her expression steady, because the decision had already been made. Not in the moment the invitation arrived, not in the conversation with Daniel, but long before that, when she first understood that truth, when structured correctly, does not require confrontation to be revealed. It requires timing. And the wedding, with its audience, its visibility, its carefully constructed narrative, provided exactly that. The ballroom had been designed to impress before anyone even entered it. High ceilings, framed by crystal chandeliers, cast a controlled brilliance across polished marble floors, while long arrangements of white orchids and soft candlelight softened the severity of the space, just enough to suggest elegance rather than excess. Every detail had been curated with intention, not extravagance for its own sake, but a precise projection of status. Ethan Caldwell understood environments like this. He understood how they shaped perception, how they reinforced narratives before a single word was spoken. The venue was not just a setting, It was an extension of the message he intended to deliver. Everything about the evening suggested arrival. Guests began to gather well before the ceremony. They moved through the space with practiced ease, investors, attorneys, executives, individuals, accustomed to environments where relationships were both social and strategic. Conversations layered over one another, light in tone but heavy with subtext. Names were exchanged, positions acknowledged, value assessed. Elizabeth Warren arrived without announcement. There was no shift in the room when she entered. No pause in conversation, no immediate recognition. She did not draw attention because she did not seek it. Her appearance was deliberate in its restraint. A tailored black dress, structured but unadorned, minimal jewelry. No attempt to compete with the visual language of the event. She was not there to be seen. She was there to be present. That distinction mattered. As she stepped into the ballroom, her eyes moved not quickly, not scanning in the obvious sense, but observing with quiet precision. She registered the layout, the positioning of tables, the flow of movement between spaces. She noted where conversations clustered, where attention gravitated, where influence concentrated. It was not unlike entering a courtroom. Different context, same principles. At the far end of the room, near the elevated platform prepared for the ceremony, Vanessa Blake stood surrounded by a small group of guests. Her presence was unmistakable. She wore a gown that balanced modern simplicity with deliberate detail, clean lines, subtle structure, nothing excessive, yet everything calculated to reinforce the image she had cultivated over the past year. Confident, composed, in control. She spoke with ease, her gestures measured, her expressions aligned with the expectations of the moment. Beside her, Ethan moved between conversations with practiced fluidity. He greeted guests with familiarity, laughter coming easily, his posture relaxed but attentive. He had always excelled in environments like this, spaces where perception could be shaped through presence alone. When he first saw Elizabeth, there was a brief pause. Not long enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough. His expression adjusted almost immediately. Recognition, then calculation, then something closer to satisfaction. He excused himself from the group he was speaking with and moved toward her. "Elizabeth," he said, his tone smooth, controlled. She turned to face him. "Ethan." No hesitation, no inflection beyond acknowledgement. For a moment they stood facing each other, separated not by distance but by everything that had occurred between them and everything that had not yet been revealed. "I'm glad you came," he said. Elizabeth regarded him steadily. "You invited me," she replied. Ethan smiled slightly, as if the exchange confirmed something he had already assumed. "Yes," he said. "I thought it was important." Elizabeth did not ask why. She did not need to. Instead, she shifted her attention briefly toward the room. "It's well attended," she observed. Ethan followed her gaze. "It's an important night," he said. The statement carried more weight than its simplicity suggested. Elizabeth nodded once. "I see that." Before the conversation could extend further, Vanessa approached. Her movement was intentional, not hurried, not hesitant. She had already noticed Elizabeth's presence from across the room. The introduction, therefore, was not spontaneous. "Elizabeth," Vanessa said, offering a composed smile. "I'm glad you could make it." Her voice was warm but measured. There was no visible tension in her posture, no overt sign of discomfort. If anything, she appeared curious, studying Elizabeth with a kind of quiet interest. Elizabeth returned the look with equal steadiness. "Thank you," she said. "It's a significant evening." Vanessa inclined her head slightly. "It is." There was a brief silence. Not awkward, not strained, simply contained. Ethan stepped slightly between them, though not overtly enough to suggest interruption. "I was just telling Elizabeth how much this means," he said, his tone shifting subtly, becoming more performative as nearby guests began to take notice. Vanessa's smile deepened, though her eyes remained focused. "It's been a long time coming," she said. Elizabeth observed the interaction without comment. She noted the alignment between their words, the way they reinforced each other's narrative, the consistency of their presentation. It was cohesive, effective, and from the outside entirely convincing. Guests began to circulate closer. Introductions were made, names exchanged. Elizabeth was included in these interactions, though not positioned at the center of them. To most, she was simply present. a former connection, a detail. Yet among certain individuals, those who operated within legal and financial frameworks, her name carried a different weight. A few recognized it, not immediately, but gradually. A glance held slightly longer than usual. A pause before moving on. Subtle signals that suggested awareness without declaration. Elizabeth acknowledged none of it directly. She moved through the space with the same quiet composure she had maintained since entering. She did not engage deeply in conversation. She did not withdraw either. She existed within the room without attempting to influence it, because influence in this context would come later. The ceremony approached. Guests were guided toward their seats. The lighting shifted slightly softer, more focused on the platform where the vows would be exchanged. Elizabeth took her place without hesitation. Not at the front, not hidden, positioned precisely where she needed to be. From there, she could observe everything. The officiant began. Words about partnership, commitment, shared futures filled the space, delivered with the practiced cadence of ceremonies designed to feel personal regardless of the audience. Ethan and Vanessa stood together at the center. They listened. They responded. They performed the roles expected of them with clarity and confidence. To anyone watching, it was seamless. A union built on alignment, a future defined by shared purpose. Elizabeth watched without interruption. Her expression did not change, because she was not watching the ceremony as an emotional event. She was observing it as a structure, a culmination of narrative, a moment designed to solidify perception. And she understood with complete certainty that perception, no matter how carefully constructed, remains dependent on what supports it. The vows concluded. Applause followed, measured at first, then expanding as the room responded collectively. Ethan and Vanessa turned toward their guests, toward the audience that validated their union, toward the narrative they had built. And somewhere within that audience, unremarkable in her stillness, Elizabeth Warren remained exactly where she had positioned herself. Not as a participant in their story, but as the one who already understood how it would unfold. The transition from ceremony to reception unfolded with seamless precision, as though every movement had been rehearsed to maintain the illusion of effortlessness. Music replaced vows, conversation replaced applause, and the room already primed for admiration shifted into a more fluid display of celebration. Servers moved quietly between tables, carrying glasses that never remained empty for long. Laughter rose in controlled intervals, never too loud, never too spontaneous. Everything was calibrated to reflect success not only in union but in status. Ethan Caldwell thrived in this phase. If the ceremony had required composure, the reception allowed for performance. He moved through the crowd with renewed energy, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention without seeming to demand it. Each handshake lingered the right amount of time, each exchange tailored to the individual he addressed. Vanessa Blake remained near the center, her presence anchoring the room. Guests approached her rather than the other way around, offering congratulations that reinforced her position not only as a bride but as a figure of increasing influence. Elizabeth Warren observed all of it. She had not moved far from where she had been seated during the ceremony, though her posture remained relaxed, her attention dispersed rather than fixed. From a distance, she appeared disengaged, present but uninvolved. In reality, she was mapping. Not the people, the interactions. Who spoke to whom, who deferred, who watched without participating, which conversations carried weight and which existed only to fill silence. Because in rooms like this, hierarchy reveals itself not through titles but through behavior. It was Ethan who shifted the dynamic. He did not do so abruptly. He waited for the right moment, for the room to settle into rhythm, for attention to disperse just enough that it could be redirected without resistance. Then, with a glass raised and a tone that balanced warmth with authority, he called for quiet. Conversation softened, not entirely, but enough. Eyes turned, some out of curiosity, others out of expectation. Ethan stood near the center of the room, Vanessa at his side. The positioning was deliberate, close enough to suggest unity, distinct enough to allow him to lead. "I just want to say a few words," he began, his voice carrying with practiced ease. There was a ripple of approval, light applause, a few encouraging remarks. Nothing unexpected. He smiled, allowing the moment to settle before continuing. "Tonight means a great deal to both of us," he said, glancing briefly at Vanessa. "Not just because of what we're starting, but because of everything that led us here." The phrasing was intentional. It acknowledged the past without defining it. It invited attention without specifying direction. Elizabeth did not move. Her gaze remained steady, her expression unchanged. Ethan continued. "Life has a way of teaching you what works," he said, pacing his words carefully, "and sometimes, more importantly, what doesn't." A few guests smiled. Others leaned in slightly. The tone had shifted, still polite, but edged with something less neutral. Ethan let the silence linger just long enough to create anticipation. Then he spoke again. "And sometimes," he added, "those lessons come from people who were never meant to be part of your future." The room reacted subtly. A shift in posture. A glance exchanged between guests. Recognition beginning to form. Elizabeth felt it not as pressure but as alignment, because she already understood where this was going. Ethan turned slightly, his gaze moving through the room until it settled on her. There was no hesitation, no ambiguity. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice carrying clearly, "now, would you join us for a moment?" The request was framed politely, but it was not optional. Not in this context. Not in this room. Attention shifted instantly. Where there had been scattered focus, there was now convergence. Elizabeth rose without delay. Her movement was neither slow nor hurried. It was measured, controlled. As she walked toward the center, the room adjusted around her, not physically but perceptually. Conversations stopped. Observations sharpened. The space between her and the platform seemed longer than it was defined, more by expectation than distance. Ethan watched her approach with a faint, contained smile. Vanessa observed more closely. Not with hostility, but with interest. This, she understood, was not spontaneous. Elizabeth reached the front. She did not step onto the platform immediately. Instead, she paused just below it, allowing the positioning to define itself. Ethan gestured lightly. "Please," he said. Elizabeth stepped up. Now level with them. Now fully within view. The room held its breath, not dramatically, but collectively. Ethan turned slightly toward the audience. "I think it's important," he began, "to acknowledge the people who shape us, even if their role doesn't last." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward. Vanessa remained still. Elizabeth did not react. Ethan continued, his tone softening just enough to suggest sincerity. "Elizabeth and I were married for several years," he said. "And during that time I learned a great deal." The statement on its surface was neutral, but context gave it weight. "I learned what it means to try," he added. "To build something that ultimately doesn't hold." There was a light ripple of laughter. Not loud, not unanimous, but present. Elizabeth heard it. She did not respond. Ethan glanced at her briefly, as if expecting acknowledgement. When none came, he continued. "And I think," he said, "that kind of experience is valuable, because it shows you what you need to move beyond." The phrasing sharpened. No longer abstract, now directed. Vanessa's expression remained composed, though her attention had narrowed slightly. Ethan took a small step forward, positioning himself just ahead of Elizabeth, though still within her space. "She taught me," he said, his voice steady, "what failure looks like." This time the reaction was clearer. A few guests laughed more openly. Others looked away. Some exchanged glances that carried discomfort rather than amusement. Phones lifted. Not all of them, but enough. Elizabeth stood still, not rigid, not passive, simply unmoved. She did not interrupt. She did not defend, because defense would validate the premise. And she did not accept it. Ethan let the moment settle, as though the statement required space to resonate. Then he turned slightly toward Vanessa, softening his expression. "And because of that," he added, "I was able to recognize something better when I found it." Vanessa inclined her head, accepting the implication without verbal response. The audience followed. Applause returned, uncertain at first, then building as collective behavior overrode individual hesitation. Elizabeth remained where she was, unchanged. Because while the room absorbed Ethan's narrative, she was already positioned beyond it. She had anticipated this. Not the exact words, not the precise structure, but the intention, public framing, controlled humiliation, a moment designed to define her in absence of her voice. And she understood something Ethan did not. Moments like this only hold power when they remain unchallenged by reality. Ethan believed he had created a conclusion, a closing statement, a final positioning of the past within the narrative of his future. But Elizabeth did not see an ending. She saw timing. And the timing was almost exact. Applause once initiated has a way of sustaining itself beyond its natural lifespan, especially in rooms where social alignment often outweighs personal conviction. What began as a scattered reaction to Ethan Caldwell's words quickly consolidated into a polite collective response, as though the room had agreed implicitly without discussion that acknowledgement was easier than resistance. Elizabeth Warren did not join. She remained standing where Ethan had positioned her hands resting lightly at her sides, her expression neither hardened nor softened by what had just occurred. She did not look at Ethan. She did not look at Vanessa. Instead, her gaze moved not outward, not toward the center, but slightly beyond, as though she were observing a layer of the room others had not yet noticed. Ethan, for his part, interpreted the moment as complete. He allowed the applause to settle before offering a brief, satisfied nod, his posture relaxing just enough to signal closure. The speech from his perspective had achieved its purpose. It had reframed the past in a way that elevated the present. It had established contrast. It had in his mind secured narrative control. "Thank you," he said, raising his glass slightly. "To new beginnings." The phrase landed cleanly. Familiar. Safe. Guests echoed it. To new beginnings. Glasses lifted. Contact was made. The ritual completed. And just like that, the room began to move again. Conversations resumed, first cautiously, then with growing ease as the tension dissipated into the background. Music rose slightly in volume, filling the space left behind by attention. Servers re-entered the flow, restoring rhythm where it had briefly paused. Elizabeth stepped down from the platform without announcement. No one stopped her. No one addressed her directly. And yet, as she moved through the room, something had shifted, not loudly, not definitively, but enough. Because among the guests were individuals who did not process events purely through social cues. They processed them through recognition. Michael Grant was one of them, a senior corporate attorney with a reputation built not on visibility but on accuracy. Michael had attended the reception as a guest of one of Monarch Axis Group's early investors. He had no personal investment in the narrative Ethan had just presented. He was not concerned with social positioning. He was concerned with names. And when he heard Elizabeth Warren introduced not formally but through implication, something in his memory aligned. He did not react immediately. He watched. As Elizabeth moved away from the center, Michael observed her posture, her composure, the absence of any defensive response. It was not passivity. It was control. That in itself was not unusual. What caught his attention was the name, Warren. It was not uncommon, but within certain contexts, it carried weight. He excused himself from his current conversation and stepped aside, retrieving his phone, not to call, not to message, but to verify. A quick search. Internal databases, cross-referencing, and then confirmation. Elizabeth Warren, corporate attorney, specializing in regulatory structures, investment frameworks, and high-level financial compliance. Previous advisory roles connected to firms that intersected indirectly with entities Michael had encountered before, including Redwood Capital Partners. Michael's expression did not change, but his attention sharpened. Because Redwood Capital was not just another investor. It had in recent months increased its position within Monarch Axis Group in ways that, while not overtly dominant, were consistent, strategic, and increasingly influential. Michael lowered his phone slowly, his gaze returning to Elizabeth. She was no longer at the center of the room. She had repositioned herself near one of the peripheral tables, speaking briefly with a guest whose identity Michael did not immediately recognize. Her tone was calm, her gestures minimal. There was no indication that she had just been publicly diminished. That absence of reaction combined with the alignment of her name created a question. And Michael Grant did not ignore questions. Across the room, Ethan continued moving through conversations, unaware of the shift beginning at the edges of his carefully constructed environment. He laughed, easily accepted congratulations, reinforced the narrative he had just established. From his perspective, the moment had passed. The room had responded as expected. Vanessa, however, was less settled. She maintained her composure, her interactions unchanged on the surface, but her attention had narrowed in subtle ways. She watched the room more closely now, not for admiration, but for deviation. Something, though she could not yet define it, had altered. It was not the speech itself. It was what followed. A slight delay in responses. a hesitation in certain conversations. A few guests who, instead of re-engaging immediately, had stepped back, observing rather than participating. Vanessa noticed these details. She did not address them, but she did not dismiss them either. Elizabeth, meanwhile, remained exactly where she had chosen to be, not hidden, not central. Positioned within the room's periphery where observation becomes easier and expectation less defined. She checked her watch once. A small, almost imperceptible movement, then she returned her attention to the space around her. Because timing once set does not require adjustment, only awareness. Michael approached her after a brief hesitation. "Miss Warren," he said, his tone respectful but direct. Elizabeth turned slightly toward him. "Yes. My name is Michael Grant," he continued. "I believe we may have overlapping connections." Elizabeth regarded him calmly. "That's possible," she said. Michael inclined his head. "I work in corporate advisory," he added, "primarily in financial structuring." Elizabeth nodded once. "I'm familiar with your work," she said. It was not flattery. It was acknowledgement. Michael paused briefly, choosing his next words with care. "I couldn't help but notice," he said, "your association with Redwood Capital." The statement was neutral, but precise. Elizabeth did not react outwardly. "Redwood has a wide range of interests," she replied. Michael held her gaze for a moment longer. "Yes," he said, "it does." There was a silence, not uncomfortable but intentional. Then Michael stepped back slightly. "I imagine," he added, "the next few hours will be informative." Elizabeth met his gaze without deviation. "They usually are," she said. Michael nodded once. Then he moved away. The exchange lasted less than a minute, but it was enough. Because recognition once initiated does not remain isolated. It spreads, quietly, through conversation, through inference, through individuals who understand how to connect information without needing it to be explained. Across the room, small clusters of discussion began to shift. Names mentioned, connections drawn, questions forming not yet voiced openly but present. Ethan did not notice. Vanessa began to. Elizabeth did not need to observe every detail. She only needed to know that the system had begun to respond. Because once awareness enters a structure, it changes. Not immediately, not visibly, but inevitably. And somewhere beyond the surface of celebration, beyond the music and the movement and the carefully maintained narrative, the first fracture had already formed. The shift did not announce itself. There was no sudden silence, no dramatic interruption, no visible break in the rhythm of the evening that would allow Ethan Caldwell to recognize in real time that something irreversible had already begun. The music continued, conversations overlapped, and the structure of the reception held at least on the surface. But beneath that surface, alignment was changing. And Elizabeth Warren, standing quietly near the edge of the room, knew the exact moment it would. She did not look at her phone when it happened. She did not need to. The email had been scheduled with precision-timed, not to disrupt the ceremony nor to coincide with Ethan's speech, but to arrive in the space immediately after, when attention had dispersed just enough to allow information to circulate, organically without appearing forced. It was not sent to everyone. Only to those whose roles required response. Members of the Monarch Axis Group Board, internal legal counsel, external compliance advisors, a select group of investors whose positions carried weight beyond capital. The subject line was simple, direct, free of implication. Review required financial activity and governance alignment. The body of the email was structured the way Elizabeth structured everything, with clarity, restraint, and evidence that required no embellishment. There were no accusations, no emotional language, no framing designed to persuade, only information. Documented financial transfers traced across multiple accounts, each supported by attached records, timelines that aligned those transfers with internal company decisions, correspondence that, when viewed independently, might have appeared routine, but when placed within sequence, revealed patterns that could not be dismissed as coincidence. At the center of it all, Ethan Caldwell, not as a central figure by title, but as a consistent presence across transactions that intersected with company resources. The email did not conclude with a demand. It concluded with a recommendation. Immediate internal review advised to assess compliance exposure and fiduciary alignment. Nothing more, nothing less. Across the room, the first indication of its arrival came not from sound, but from posture. Vanessa Blake felt it before she understood it. Her phone placed discreetly beside her glass vibrated once. Then again. A pause. Then a third time. She did not reach for it immediately. She was mid-conversation, speaking with one of Monarch Axis's early investors, a man whose interest had been instrumental in the company's initial growth phase. But the pattern of interruption was unusual, persistent but controlled. She excused herself with a brief practiced smile. "Just a moment," she said. She stepped slightly away from the table, her hand closing around the phone with a composure that had not yet fractured. When she looked at the screen, her expression did not change, but her attention did. Multiple notifications, all from individuals within the same network. Board members, legal counsel. One message more direct than the others. "Have you seen this?" Vanessa opened the email. She read the subject line once. Then again. Her eyes moved through the content quickly at first, scanning, searching for context, for framing, for anything that would allow her to categorize what she was seeing as preliminary, incomplete, or misinterpreted. She did not find it, so she read again. Slower. This time the structure revealed itself. Each section built on the previous one. Each document connected. Each transaction aligned with a broader pattern that extended beyond isolated activity. And within that pattern, Ethan. Her grip on the phone tightened, though her posture remained outwardly composed. She did not look up immediately, because looking up would require acknowledging what she had just read. Instead, she continued to process. Across the room, similar reactions began to emerge. Michael Grant checked his phone and did not return to his previous conversation. Another investor seated near the center leaned slightly away from the table, his attention shifting inward as he reviewed the same material. A member of the legal team, positioned near the back, read the email once, then immediately began scrolling through the attachments with increasing focus. No one spoke. Not yet. Because the information required verification. And verification required attention. Ethan, meanwhile, remained engaged in conversation, unaware of the shift that was moving through the room not as noise but as awareness. He noticed eventually that Vanessa had stepped away. He followed her with his eyes, expecting her to return within moments. When she did not, he excused himself and moved toward her. "Everything all right?" he asked, his tone casual, though his attention sharpened slightly as he approached. Vanessa looked up. For a moment she said nothing. Then she turned the phone slightly toward him. "Read this," she said. Her voice was controlled. Too controlled. Ethan took the phone, his expression still neutral, still anchored in the assumption that whatever he was about to see could be explained, reframed, or dismissed. He read the subject line. A slight shift. Then the first paragraph. Another. By the time he reached the attached documents, his posture had changed. Not dramatically, but enough. His shoulders tightened, his jaw set slightly. "This is—" he began, then stopped. Vanessa watched him, not as a partner, as a variable. "Do you recognize any of this?" she asked. The question was direct, unprotected. Ethan scrolled further, his eyes moving faster now, searching for context that would allow him to regain control of the situation. "These are partial records," he said. "They don't show the full picture." Vanessa did not respond immediately, because she had already noticed what Ethan had not. The records were not partial, they were selective. And selection, when done correctly, reveals more than completeness. "Who sent this?" Ethan asked, his voice lower now. Vanessa did not answer. She turned the phone back toward herself and scrolled to the top. The sender's name was clear. Elizabeth Warren. Ethan's expression shifted again. This time not controlled, not calculated. Something closer to realization. Across the room, conversations began to fracture. Not loudly, but definitively. Small groups formed not around celebration but around information. Phones were no longer idle. They were active, connected, processing. Elizabeth remained where she was, unmoved, because the email was not the event. It was the catalyst. And catalysts, once introduced, do not need to be repeated. They act. Vanessa looked up again, her gaze moving across the room, not randomly but searching, until it found Elizabeth, standing exactly where she had been, unchanged, unaffected, not observing the reaction, not engaging with it, simply present. Vanessa understood in that moment something she had not considered before. Control is not always visible, and absence of reaction is not absence of intent. Ethan followed her gaze. His eyes landed on Elizabeth, and for the first time that evening, he did not see someone from his past. He saw a variable he had not accounted for, and the system, the one he believed he understood, was no longer responding the way he expected. The room did not collapse. It recalibrated. What had once been a space defined by celebration, measured laughter, curated conversations, the quiet exchange of status began to reorganize itself around something far less comfortable, yet far more compelling: verification. No one raised their voice. No one made a scene. But the energy shifted in a way that could not be reversed. Because the kind of people gathered in that ballroom did not respond to emotion. They responded to data. Elizabeth Warren remained still, her posture unchanged, her attention steady but not fixed. She did not watch Ethan. She did not watch Vanessa. Instead, she allowed the room to process what had already been introduced into it. Because once information enters a system like this, it does not need guidance. It moves on its own. At one table near the center, two investors leaned closer together, their conversation no longer casual. "Look at the timestamps," one of them murmured, angling his phone slightly. "They align with the Q2 expansion decisions," the other replied, his tone low but precise. "And the destination, accounts layered. Not direct, but consistent." A pause followed. Not confusion, recognition. Across the room, similar exchanges unfolded. A compliance officer scrolled through the attachments, his brow tightening not in alarm but in calculation. A legal advisor standing near the back had already begun cross-referencing the data with internal governance expectations, his attention narrowing as the implications became clearer. No one spoke loudly, but no one returned to celebration either. Near the center, Vanessa Blake stood with controlled stillness, her phone still in her hand, her eyes moving through the email once more, not searching for meaning but confirming it. The structure was undeniable. Each document supported the next. Each transaction connected. Each timeline reinforced a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence or misinterpretation. These were not random discrepancies. They were aligned movements. And at the center of that alignment, Ethan Caldwell. Vanessa lifted her gaze slowly. The room, though still filled with people, no longer felt unified. Conversations had fractured into clusters, defined not by familiarity but by shared understanding. She turned toward Ethan. "This isn't partial," she said quietly. "It's structured." Ethan exhaled, his composure tightening rather than breaking. "It's selective," he replied. "That's different." Vanessa held his gaze. "Selective," she repeated, then explained the selection. Ethan did not answer immediately, because explanation required coherence, and coherence required consistency. He reached for the phone again, scrolling through the attachments with increased urgency as though speed might compensate for what clarity could not provide. "These transfers," he began, "they were part of a broader allocation strategy. Temporary movements. Nothing outside operational scope." Vanessa did not interrupt, but she did not accept the explanation either. "Then why aren't they reflected in board disclosures?" she asked. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. They didn't require board-level reporting. The answer was technically possible, but structurally weak. Vanessa recognized the gap. Because she had seen the thresholds, she understood what required disclosure. "These amounts cross internal review limits," she said, her tone still controlled but no longer neutral. "Multiple times." Ethan's silence this time extended just long enough to register. Across the room, Michael Grant had moved to a quieter corner, his phone held steady as he reviewed the documents with the same discipline he brought to every case he handled. He was no longer observing the event. He was analyzing the exposure. The pattern was clear. Funds originating from accounts associated with Monarch Axis, redirected through intermediary entities, re-entering adjacent structures in ways that blurred origin and intent. Not illegal on the surface, but not clean either. And in corporate governance, clean matters. Michael looked up briefly. His gaze moved across the room, then settled once again on Elizabeth. She had not moved, had not spoken, had not engaged. Yet everything unfolding could be traced back to a single action she had taken quietly, precisely, without announcement. Back near the center, a small group of investors had stepped slightly away from their table, their conversation low but focused. If this holds, one of them said, it's not just misallocation. It's exposure, another replied, and governance failure. A third voice added, we need verification before we react. Yes, the first agreed, but we also need distance. The word lingered. Distance, not emotional. Strategic. Vanessa felt it. Not in what was being said directly to her, but in what was no longer being said. Conversations that had included her, now adjusted. Attention that had centered around her now dispersed. Not dramatically, but enough. She turned again to Ethan. Did you move company-linked funds through external entities without disclosure? She asked. The question this time was direct, stripped of interpretation. Ethan met her gaze. For a moment he considered the response not in terms of truth but in terms of control. They were temporary reallocations, he said, structured to support positioning. Vanessa's expression did not change, but something within it settled. Because the answer, though framed as justification, confirmed the action. And confirmation in this context was enough. Around them the room continued to shift. Not visibly to those who were not paying attention, but definitively. Because once financial integrity is questioned, everything else becomes secondary. Elizabeth remained still. Her role complete. She had not spoken. She had not accused. She had not defended herself against what had been said earlier. Because she understood something Ethan never had, power does not respond to humiliation. It waits for structure to collapse, and then it simply allows the truth to stand. By the time the realization began to settle across the room, it did not arrive as a single unified understanding, nor did it require a formal announcement to give it weight. Instead, it formed gradually through convergence, as individual interpretations aligned with one another, and produced a shared conclusion that no longer depended on speculation. The email had introduced the structure, the financial records had reinforced it, and now the room itself, through quiet exchanges, measured distance, and shifting attention, was completing the process. Elizabeth Warren remained exactly where she had been, neither retreating nor advancing, her presence steady within a space that had begun to reorganize itself around information rather than perception. She did not need to observe every conversation to understand their direction, because the pattern had already been established. Once individuals within a system begin to verify independently, alignment follows naturally. Vanessa Blake understood this before Ethan did. Her attention, though still anchored in the documents she had reviewed, had expanded outward, taking in the altered behavior of those around her. Investors who had only minutes earlier approached her with open engagement now maintained a subtle distance. Conversations that once included her now shifted direction when she entered them. Even those who remained outwardly supportive did so with a restraint that suggested recalculation rather than confidence. This was not rejection. Not yet. It was assessment, and assessment in environments governed by risk precedes decision. Ethan, however, continued to process the situation through a narrower lens. His focus remained fixed on the content of the email, on the possibility of reframing, of reasserting control through explanation. He had not yet fully accounted for the fact that the room no longer required his narrative to interpret what it was seeing. This is being misread, he said, his voice lower now, directed toward Vanessa, but shaped by the awareness that others might still be listening. There's context missing. These structures, these transfers, they're part of positioning strategies, not violations. Vanessa did not respond immediately, not because she was considering his explanation, but because she was measuring it against what she knew to be required within the governance framework she had been operating under. The distinction between strategy and exposure was not theoretical. It was procedural. And procedure, once compromised, does not recover through language alone. Then why wasn't that context documented, she asked, her tone even but no longer accommodating. Why wasn't it disclosed through the channels that exist specifically for that purpose? Ethan's silence, though brief, carried more weight than any answer he might have offered. Because in that silence was acknowledgement not necessarily of intent but of omission. Before he could respond, a new presence entered the dynamic. James Holloway, lead external counsel for Monarch Axis Group, had been among the recipients of the email. He had not reacted immediately, nor had he approached the situation with urgency that might draw attention. Instead, he had done what his role required. He reviewed, verified, and confirmed. Now, having done so, he moved toward the center of the room. His approach was not dramatic. He did not interrupt conversations or call for attention, yet his presence once noticed carried its own gravity. Those familiar with him understood that he did not engage without purpose. "Vanessa," he said, his tone respectful but direct. Vanessa turned toward him, her posture straightening slightly, not out of defensiveness but out of recognition. "James," she replied. "I believe we need to speak," he continued. There was no hesitation in his voice, no ambiguity. Vanessa nodded once. "Now?" she asked. James met her gaze steadily. "Yes." Ethan stepped slightly forward, positioning himself within the conversation. "This concerns me as well," he said. James regarded him briefly, not dismissively, but without granting the same level of inclusion. "It concerns the company," he replied, "and its governance." The distinction was subtle, but intentional. Vanessa noticed it. Ethan did as well. They moved a short distance away from the main flow of the room, though not far enough to escape observation entirely. The shift in positioning alone was enough to draw attention not overtly but peripherally as those nearby adjusted their focus just enough to remain aware. James did not begin with explanation. He began with confirmation. "The material circulated this evening has been reviewed," he said, preliminarily but sufficiently to establish that it cannot be dismissed. Vanessa's expression remained composed. "What specifically are we looking at?" she asked. James answered without hesitation. "Financial activity involving company-linked resources that appears to have occurred outside established reporting structures," he said. "The pattern as presented suggests potential misalignment with fiduciary obligations." Ethan's posture shifted. "That's an interpretation," he said, "not a conclusion." James inclined his head slightly. "It is an interpretation supported by documented evidence," he replied, "which is why it requires formal review." Vanessa's attention sharpened. "What does that review involve?" she asked. "A temporary internal investigation," James said. "Immediate access to all relevant financial records and, depending on findings, potential escalation to external audit." The words were measured, controlled, but their implications extended far beyond procedure. Ethan recognized that. "This is being initiated based on one email?" he asked, his tone tightening despite his attempt to maintain composure. James met his gaze without deviation. "It is being initiated based on the content of that email," he said, "which, as of now, has not been contradicted by any available data." Silence followed. Not empty, but dense, because within that silence was the recognition that control had shifted. Vanessa understood it fully now, not as a personal affront, not as a moment of embarrassment, but as a structural transition. She turned her attention away from Ethan, not dramatically, not as rejection, but as reprioritization. "What needs to happen next?" she asked James. "An emergency board review will need to be convened," he said, "preferably within the next 24 hours. Vanessa nodded once. "And until then," James paused briefly, "certain roles may need to be limited," he said carefully. The phrasing was deliberate, but the meaning was clear. Ethan did not respond, because he understood. Across the room, the shift had become more visible. Not in noise, but in movement. Guests who had remained began to reposition. Some moved toward exits, others formed tighter clusters. Phones remained active. Conversations continued, but no longer about celebration. Elizabeth observed all of it without expression. She did not move closer. She did not step forward, because her role in this moment was not to reveal. It was to allow. Allow the structure to assert itself. Allow the system to respond. Allow the truth already present to be recognized without intervention. Vanessa, after a brief pause, looked across the room. Her gaze found Elizabeth, and this time she did not see a former wife. She did not see a passive presence. She saw control, not displayed, not declared, but undeniable. Ethan followed her gaze. And in that moment, the final alignment occurred, because what he saw was not the woman he had attempted to define. It was the one who had already defined the outcome. The reception did not end. It dissolved. Not abruptly, not in a way that would invite spectacle or public collapse, but through a gradual withdrawal of certainty that left the structure intact while emptying it of meaning. Music still played, though fewer people listened. Glasses remained filled, though fewer were raised. Conversations continued, but their content had shifted irreversibly from celebration to consequence. Elizabeth Warren observed the transition without movement, her posture unchanged, her attention neither fixed nor dispersed, but calibrated to the pace at which the system was now correcting itself. She had not initiated chaos. She had introduced clarity, and clarity once present does not require reinforcement to produce effect. Near the center of the room, Vanessa Blake stood with a composure that had become more deliberate, more constructed than before, as though each movement now required conscious calibration. The earlier ease had been replaced not by panic but by control of a different kind, the control that emerges when options begin to narrow. James Holloway remained beside her, his presence steady, his role no longer advisory but procedural. "We need to formalize this," he said quietly, ensuring his tone remained contained within the immediate space around them. "The longer we delay, the more exposure increases." Vanessa nodded, her gaze briefly lowering before returning to meet his. "Then we proceed," she said, immediately. The decision, though expected, carried weight beyond its simplicity. It marked a transition from uncertainty to action, from interpretation to process. And in corporate governance, process is where consequence becomes irreversible. Ethan Caldwell stood slightly apart from them now, not excluded by position but separated by implication. His earlier attempts to frame the situation had dissipated in the face of documentation that no longer required interpretation. He remained composed, but the composure no longer carried authority. It carried containment. "This is premature," he said, his voice controlled but edged with strain. "You're escalating without full context." Vanessa did not turn toward him immediately, because turning would acknowledge equivalence, and equivalence in this moment no longer existed. "The context will be reviewed," she said, her tone even, "through the appropriate channels." Ethan stepped forward slightly, attempting to reassert presence within the conversation. "You're making a decision based on timing, not substance," he said. Vanessa turned then, not sharply, not emotionally, but with clarity. "I'm making a decision based on governance," she replied. The distinction was precise and final. James inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the alignment. "I'll initiate the board notification," he said. "Emergency session, within 24 hours. Until then, we'll need to implement interim measures." Ethan's attention sharpened. "What kind of measures?" he asked. James met his gaze directly. "Restrictions on financial authorization," he said, "and limitation of involvement in ongoing transactions." The phrasing remained controlled, but the implication was unmistakable. Ethan did not respond immediately, because response in this context would not alter the outcome. Around them, the room continued to thin. Guests who had once been central to the event now moved toward the periphery, their departures understated but intentional. No one announced their exit. No one offered explanations. They simply left, not out of discomfort, but out of calculation. Because proximity once associated with risk is reassessed quickly in environments where reputation is currency. Michael Grant was among the last to remain within the central space. He had not re-engaged in casual conversation, nor had he approached Elizabeth again. Instead, he observed the procedural shift now taking place, recognizing it for what it was, the early stage of formal accountability. He checked his phone once more, reviewing the email that had initiated the sequence. The clarity of its structure, the restraint of its language, the precision of its documentation, none of it suggested impulse. It suggested preparation. Michael looked across the room. Elizabeth remained where she had been, unmoved, uninvolved, yet central to everything that had occurred. He understood then that this was not an exposure driven by reaction. It was an outcome driven by design. Near the platform, Vanessa began issuing instructions quietly, efficiently, without drawing unnecessary attention. "Contact the board," she said to James. "And legal. I want all relevant documents secured before the review." James nodded. "It's already in motion," he replied. Vanessa turned slightly, addressing another member of the internal team. "Pause all discretionary transactions," she said. "Nothing moves without review." The response was immediate. "Understood." Ethan watched this unfold, his position within the system shifting with each instruction given. He was no longer part of the decision-making process. He was adjacent to it, and adjacency in structures like this is the first step toward removal. "This doesn't need to happen here," he said, his voice lower now, directed toward Vanessa but carrying the weight of urgency he had not displayed before. "We can handle this internally." Quietly, Vanessa regarded him for a moment, not with hostility, but with assessment. "It is being handled internally," she said. "This is what that looks like." Ethan's expression tightened, because what he had meant by internally was control, and control was no longer his. Across the room, Elizabeth shifted her attention once, not toward Ethan, not toward Vanessa, but toward the exit. The timing was approaching, not because the situation required her presence, but because her presence was no longer required. She had not spoken. She had not intervened. She had not responded to the humiliation that had preceded all of this, because response would have reduced the moment to something personal, and this was never personal. It was structural. The system had been allowed to reveal itself. The process had begun, and now it would continue without her. She turned and began to walk toward the exit. Her movement was unhurried, her posture unchanged, her expression steady. No one stopped her. No one called her name. But several people noticed, not because she demanded attention, but because in a room where everything had shifted, she remained the only constant. Vanessa saw her, just briefly. Their eyes met across the distance. No words were exchanged. None were needed, because understanding in that moment did not require explanation. Ethan saw her as well, and for the first time that evening he did not attempt to speak, because he understood something he had not before. This was never about the past. It was about position, and Elizabeth Warren had never been out of position. She reached the exit without hesitation. The doors opened. The noise of the room softened behind her, and as she stepped out into the quiet of the night, the system she had set in motion continued to unfold. Without interruption, without reversal, without her. The night outside the ballroom was quieter than it should have been. Not silent. New York rarely allows for that, but contained as though the city itself understood the difference between noise and consequence. Traffic moved in steady lines, headlights tracing predictable paths across wet pavement, while distant sirens rose and fell without urgency. The world beyond the walls of the reception continued exactly as it always had. Elizabeth Warren stepped onto the sidewalk without hesitation. The transition from controlled interior to open space required no adjustment from her. Her posture remained steady, her pace unhurried, her attention forward. She did not look back at the building, did not pause beneath its lights, did not allow the weight of what had just occurred to anchor her to that place. Because what had happened inside was already complete, not in its outcome, but in its direction. Behind her, within the ballroom she had just left, the process continued. The emergency board notification had been issued within minutes of her departure. Messages moved quickly now, not through informal channels but through official ones, where language became precise and accountability began to take form. Members of the board, some still present at the reception, others joining remotely, responded with the same measured urgency that defines environments where risk must be contained before it expands. Vanessa Blake remained inside, no longer positioned as a bride at the center of celebration, but as an executive navigating exposure. Her wedding had not ended. It had been overtaken. She stood near a smaller table, now the larger reception space having thinned to a fraction of its earlier population. The gown, still immaculate now, felt less like a symbol of arrival and more like a detail disconnected from the context she was being forced to confront. James Holloway stood beside her, reviewing incoming responses. "The board is aligned on immediate review," he said. "They want preliminary findings before the end of the day tomorrow." Vanessa nodded, her gaze fixed not on him but on the screen in front of her. "Then we proceed tonight," she said. "No delays." Her voice was steady, not unshaken, but controlled. Because control, even when limited, must be maintained to prevent further erosion. Ethan Caldwell was no longer beside her. He had moved initially to engage, then to explain, and finally to distance himself from a center that no longer held authority for him. Now he stood near the far edge of the room, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice low, his words chosen with care but lacking the confidence that had defined him earlier that evening. "Yes," he said. "I've seen it." A pause. "No, it's not being interpreted correctly." Another pause. "They don't have the full context." He stopped speaking, listening now, his expression tightening as the response on the other end of the line unfolded. Because context, once questioned, does not restore itself through insistence. It requires evidence. and evidence was no longer in his control. Across the remaining space, small groups of individuals continued to exchange information, though the tone had shifted from curiosity to calculation. Those who remained were not there out of obligation or interest in the event itself. They were there because what had begun as a private matter had transitioned into something with broader implications. Reputation, liability, position. Michael Grant, still present, observed the evolving structure with quiet attention. He had seen similar processes unfold before, not identical but familiar in their progression. Initial exposure, controlled verification, rapid alignment among decision-makers, and then inevitably formal action. He checked his phone once more, reviewing updates that had already begun to circulate within legal networks. Preliminary review initiated. Financial irregularities under examination. Executive involvement under question. The language was careful, non-accusatory, but unmistakable. Michael looked up, scanning the room one last time. Vanessa still composed. Ethan increasingly isolated. James already operating within procedural frameworks. And Elizabeth gone. He understood then that her absence was not incidental. It was part of the structure. Because those who initiate processes like this do not remain to oversee them. They ensure they are irreversible. Outside, Elizabeth reached the curb and signaled for a car. The driver arrived within moments, the door opening with quiet efficiency. She entered without comment, her movement fluid, her attention already shifting beyond the events she had left behind. As the car pulled away, the building receded into the background, not symbolically, not emotionally, but physically, as just another structure within a city defined by constant motion. Elizabeth did not check her phone. She did not review the email. She did not monitor the responses that were now unfolding in rapid succession. Because she did not need to. Everything that required her involvement had already been completed. The evidence had been structured. The timing had been executed. The system had been engaged. From this point forward, the outcome would not depend on her presence. It would depend on process. And process, once initiated within the correct framework, does not require reinforcement. It advances. In the hours that followed, the formal mechanisms began to take shape. Access to certain financial systems within Monarch Axis Group was restricted pending review. Internal records were secured not as a precaution but as a requirement. Communication channels shifted from informal to documented, ensuring that every decision moving forward would exist within a traceable structure. Ethan received notice shortly after midnight. A formal message. Clear, controlled. Pending investigation, his involvement in any company-related financial or advisory activities was suspended. The wording was careful, but the implication was final. Vanessa received a separate communication. Her position was not removed, but it was limited. Operational authority temporarily reassigned to ensure compliance during review. She read the message once, then again. Her expression did not change, but her understanding did, because authority once conditional is no longer absolute, and absolute authority was what she had believed she held. Elizabeth, meanwhile, continued forward. The city moved around her, indifferent to individual outcomes as it always had. Lights passed across the window in steady intervals, reflections shifting without permanence. She sat quietly, her posture relaxed, her gaze forward. There was no visible satisfaction, no sense of victory, because what had occurred was not a reversal of humiliation. It was not a response to what had been said. It was simply alignment. The truth had not been created. It had been revealed. And once revealed, it did not require defense. It carried itself. As the car turned onto a quieter street, Elizabeth allowed her attention to settle, not on the past, not on the events of the evening, but on what remained. Continuity, work, structure, the things that had always defined her. Because in the end, power had never been about presence. It had been about position. And Elizabeth Warren had never needed to stand at the center of the room to define its outcome. She only needed to understand how it was built, and when the time came, how it would fall. Some stories do not end with confrontation, and they do not resolve themselves through words spoken in the heat of a moment. Instead, they unfold through silence, through patience, and through an understanding that truth, when properly supported, does not need to be defended. It simply needs to be placed where it can no longer be ignored. Elizabeth never raised her voice. She never argued, never tried to reclaim dignity through reaction. She allowed time to do what time does best: reveal patterns, expose weaknesses, and separate perception from reality. What happened that night was not revenge. It was consequence. And perhaps that is where the real question begins. Not what Ethan deserved, not what Vanessa lost, but what it means to remain still when everything around you suggests you should respond. If you had been in Elizabeth's place, would you have spoken, or would you have waited? If this story stayed with you, you can let it be known quietly, the way stories like this travel. A simple, like a thought in the comments, or even just sharing where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you believe that strength does not always need to be loud to be real, then this space might be worth returning to.